Hi, Alex.
Hi there, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm pretty good, thanks. How about you?
I can't complain. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. Blogging Heads TV. This is an episode of Worldwise. You are Alex Massie in Scotland, which remains part of the United Kingdom, uh, which is a fact that you highly approve of, I think.
Yes, I mean, I voted in our independence referendum on Thursday. I voted in favour of maintaining our place in the UK. Although, and the country as a whole, obviously, supported that proposition. I mean, it was 55% in favour of maintaining the union, 45% in favour of independence. So it was one of those things that was, if you like, uh, it was clear enough to be a decisive verdict, but at the same time close enough, I think, to demand some restraint and modesty in victory.
Right, and in fact, you wrote a blog post. You write a blog for the Spectator, and you wrote a post invoking Lincoln's famous "with malice toward none and charity toward all," or whatever the exact quote is. Right.
Yeah, the second inaugural. Yeah, which obviously remains. I think most people would say, wouldn't they, one of the sort of greatest, or at least the most memorable political speeches ever given. And obviously, this was a referendum campaign that didn't have. I mean, it wasn't a war in the sense of the countryside being littered with dead bodies and so on. But rhetorically speaking, obviously, it was a very divisive and highly partisan affair, as would be expected when you've got politics of, big politics returned, and people were enthused and passionate about it, and that was reflected in the turnout, which was about 85% across the country, but actually reaching almost 90% in some areas.
And is there any residue? Do you sense any residue of kind of bitterness on the other side, or is it kind of a touchy issue when you talk to certain people, or?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, there is a deep disappointment. Yes, supporters feel that Scotland has sort of, if you like, chickened out of grasping a new and different, more exciting future.
Mm-hmm.
That we've sort of somehow let ourselves down. There is a sense that because people who voted to maintain the union tended, I mean, not exclusively, but were disproportionately older voters and wealthier voters, middle classes, that somehow counterfeits the results, but which is nonsense, obviously. But there is a disappointment, and in some quarters of the Yes movement, a suspicion that the people were betrayed, the country was betrayed. There's a lot of criticism of the media, which was seen as being biased against the Yes campaign, the BBC in particular, but also you have people sort of talking about boycotting newspapers and so on, which is, as a newspaperman and so on, is obviously disappointing. Although people have been, if you like, unofficially boycotting newspapers for a long time now. But I mean, it's always difficult to tell because, of course, you see all this sort of stuff on social media, and you get that you can have it's very easy to get the sense that it's much more widespread than it really is.
Mm-hmm.
And that was perhaps a problem during the campaign as well. But because the Yes campaign was very much more visible, and made a lot more noise, it was easy to assume that it was sort of sweeping up the entire country. But of course, there were an awful lot of people who aren't on social media, and there was in the end a silent majority to invoke Nixon's in favor of the union.
Yeah, and apparently they'd been silent. Some of them had been silent when the pollsters called, apparently, because the pollsters thought it would be a little closer than it was. Is the idea that there was such visible and kind of, cool support for? In other words, it was like the cool thing to be, in support of it, and for that reason, maybe people were reluctant to say publicly, and sometimes even to a pollster, that they opposed it.
Yeah, the shy nose syndrome, which is how it's being referred to. I think there was something to that, and of course, the Scottish government, the SNP, and Alex Salmond, the leader of it, they ran a campaign sort of contrasting what they dubbed Team Scotland against Team Westminster, which was obviously a them and us type thing, and fostered the impression that somehow if you were voting no, that was a vote of lesser quality, and suggested that you were a lesser person in many ways than people voting yes, and that upset a lot of people, I think, quite understandably. and it led to a certain reluctance.
Okay. You are
to admit to voting no on.
Okay, you're Alex. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes campaign sort of.
Your signal has gotten kind of weak or intermittent, I should say.
A critique, a withering critique of the so-called failures of the British state, but in the end, obviously, I think if you like, sort of risk aversion came into play as well. That the uncertainties of a post-independent future were such that and couldn't really be answered, particularly in terms of the economic perspectives for independence, that people decided to stick with what they had, the security of the known rather than the uncertainty of the unknown.
Now, your audio signal cut out for a little bit of that, but I think we did get the gist of what you said. Now, Alex Salmond, who was the leader of the he's the leader of the Nationalist Party, and he's the first minister in the Scottish Parliament. He is stepping down in the wake of this. Now, that kind of surprised me. Do you think that the reason he's stepping down is because expectations had been raised so high? I mean, a month ago, people would have said 55-54 was a damn good showing for the yes vote, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I always thought it would be close. I always thought that unionist dreams of winning 70-30 or even 60-40 were a pipe dream, that there was never any prospect of that. It ended up being a little bit less close than I had thought it would be. You have, again, this sort of paradox that in a binary race like this, I mean, as in an American presidential election, if somebody won 55-45 in the United States these days, that would be considered a landslide.
Yeah.
But it doesn't actually require very many people to change their minds, and suddenly you have a completely different result. Salmond has stepped down, I think, because it just sort of feels a bit like the end of an era, that he had done all he could. He had sort of, if you like, taken the people to the top of the mountaintop, and just wasn't quite able to get them down on the other side. And what was left to do, because everybody agrees, or at least everybody in the mainstream politics agrees, that independence is now off the agenda for a generation.
Now, I wonder about that, because
never-ending.
That kind of surprises me. That consensus, because, as you said, younger voters tended to vote yes, so you might extrapolate and think that 10, 15 years from now, yes could prevail, right? As more and more no voters die and more yes voters become eligible to vote.
In theory, yes, that is the case, and I suspect that the nationalists would like to come back and do this again in 15 years' time. I mean, which explains why there are some suggestions. I don't think they will come to anything, but Jack Straw, the former British Foreign Secretary, has made a suggestion today that that future referenda should essentially be made illegal. That, like the United States or like India, the United Kingdom should be considered an inviolable entity, and so on, from which secession is illegal. Now, that won't come to anything, but it shows, it gives an indication of how some people are reacting and how some people are thinking about things in the future. But against that, it supposes that people wouldn't change their minds in the future as well. And it depends on what sort of things come next. I mean, there are proposals for devolving further powers and responsibilities over taxation and other matters to the Scottish Parliament. And that would then, at least potentially, leave us in a situation where people have got basically what they want, which is a sort of quasi-federal Britain, and they have the trappings of nationhood without the requirement to be a nation state, formally, with a seat at the UN and all the rest of it. So, all the polls have sort of suggested that if you had a three-way referendum between the status quo, independence, and some package of additional powers in the Scottish Parliament, then that middle option would have won very easily, and might well have actually taken more than 50% of the vote in that sort of three-way choice. So that might satisfy the sort of political and nationalistic ambitions of the people as a whole, although there will, of course, remain people for whom independence is the ultimate and only prize worth having.
What do you think What do you think the most they can realistically expect short of that? I mean, there was this guarantee from the big political leaders of the big political parties in England right before the vote. You know, hey, we're gonna give you all these new powers if you stay in the Union. What do you think is the most now that Scotland can realistically hope for?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, the detail of these things will have to be worked out, and there are a number of issues with it that make it difficult. The first is that the Labour Party and the Conservatives have very different ambitions in this. The Labour Party essentially would like to see as little change as possible. The Conservatives are more open to significant change. I mean, they have already proposed, for instance, that Scotland would be responsible for raising all its income tax, for instance. There are other issues where EU laws make things quite difficult because you can't actually devolve things like, say, VAT taxes and so on. But in return for Scotland having more responsibility for its affairs, there is the view, very strongly held, I think, in the Conservative Party, that there should be fewer Scottish MPs at Westminster. And since there are at present, 59 Scottish MPs go to Westminster, and the great majority of them are Labour MPs, and so Labour are opposed to it. That would reduce their strength at Westminster and make it more difficult for them to win a UK general election.
That seems just to me too obviously self-serving to prevail as an idea, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, well, I mean, you are right, but there's a thing that there are people in England now who are saying, well, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales all have parliaments or assemblies and devolved responsibilities, but England doesn't. So what we need is an English parliament, so that none of the MPs from but the difficulty with that is again that you could plausibly have a thing whereby for legislation that affected the whole of the UK, you would have a majority for that, but not necessarily for legislation that affected only England. Mm-hmm. So creating a sort of two-tier parliament at Westminster is something that I think is fraught with difficulty. Although I mean from a Scottish perspective, it's quite weird to see, people in England complaining about the raw deal for England, when England is more than 80% of the population of the UK and by far and away the sort of dominant force in it. It seems very odd.
although it is true, if more and more powers are devolved to parliaments in Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland, it will start to seem odd that England has no commensurate body, no commensurate control over England per se. I mean, I can understand it. I mean, the U.S. has that on a much smaller scale. Washington, D.C., people in Washington, D.C. have no senators. Or actually people in the lower, nobody in the lower house who actually votes, I think. So you can kind of see the case from England's point of view, right? I mean, the argument grows stronger as more powers devolve onto the regional bodies.
Yes, it does. I mean, and logically, of course, the English complaint does make some sense. But the problem with trying to find some sort of some solution to these issues that is logical and rational is that the United Kingdom's constitution, unwritten though it may be, is fundamentally illogical. And so sort of tidying up one area of it simply creates additional problems elsewhere. I mean, they've been arguing about reforming the House of Lords for, at least the last 20 years. There are still some members of the House of Lords who are there as a result of their hereditary peerage. Bishops from the Church of England still have the entitlement to seats in the national legislature. No other religion is privileged or established in that fashion. So, I mean, these are not things that you would necessarily do if you were building a constitution from scratch. And so, for that reason, I'm quite sceptical about some of the plans or the timetable for doing a lot of this. And you, as you rightly said, there was a sort of last-minute offer to the Scots to sort of say, please don't go, we'll do this, X, Y, Z. And the suggestion championed by Gordon Brown, the former prime minister, and he's one of those figures who's sort of emerged from his.
Okay, so we lost you when you said that Gordon Brown had emerged from something, and we're on the edge of our seats, Alex, about what he emerged from. Do you remember exactly what that sentence was, how that sentence was finished?
Yeah. Yes. There's a sort of timetable to get a lot of these things wrapped up by January, the end of January, and which in one sense is necessary because the next British general election takes place in May of next year. So there isn't a lot of time to get these proposals firmed up. But it is a fearsomely complicated business, and that timetable seems to me pretty ambitious. I mean, except in terms of, a broad outline perhaps, but not actually necessarily a practical one on the sort of detailed level of things. And because it's not just a question of Scotland, it's not just a question of England. You have the Welsh, the Northern Irish want to get involved as well. So I suspect does London, which has its own devolved assembly, and I think would probably quite like greater responsibilities for London, which then in turn leads to, well, what about other great English cities? What about Manchester and Birmingham, Liverpool, Newcastle, and so on? So are you then talking about a sort of city-based type approach or regions in England? All of a sudden everything is on the table, but because everything is up for discussion, actually deciding what to discuss, what to talk about becomes quite difficult, and sort of picking your way through it all, is actually going to be really, really quite difficult, because you're going to probably end up with a sort of multi-layered type approach to devolution and home rule and so on, where some parts of the UK have responsibility for one thing, but that doesn't but central government will still have responsibility for it somewhere else. The breadth and depth of devolution will vary across the UK. That what is suitable for Wales is not necessarily the same as what's suitable for Scotland, far less for the north of England. So at the moment, there's not a lot of clarity really on what's going to happen next, except that everybody agrees that things have already changed and they must continue to change.
Yeah. Now, is your sense, I assume you've been paying a little attention to the international ramifications of this. The expectation had been that if there was a yes vote, then, you might have this chain reaction of secessions.
Yeah.
Do you have any sense for whether the no vote is going to dampen secessionist energy in places like Catalonia and the various other...
I'm not sure it will there, but I suspect it probably has a little in some other places, perhaps in Belgium. Yes, you're right. I mean, a yes vote I think would have been seen as exemplary in some ways. That if the Scots can do this, there's absolutely no reason why the map of Europe in particular must remain the same as it has been for some time now, and it would have shown that secession needn't be accompanied by violence. It needn't be, the sort of balkanization of Europe, or the further balkanization of Europe. And certainly, I think it would have given a great boost to Catalan separatists and perhaps in the Basque country as well. I mean, one of the notable things, in Edinburgh for the last few days has been the number of people from Spain over here. The number of Catalan nationalists and Basque separatists who came to Scotland to give their support, which basically actually, amounted to drinking beer and wandering the streets draped in a Catalan flag. But still, that this notion that somehow or other, their cause was our cause too, and vice versa. Which I think is nonsense. I mean, I have no opinion on Catalan separatism. It is none of my concern. I would say that simply that the Spanish government appears to have handled that extremely poorly, and Catalonia has said, well, we're going ahead with our referendum in November anyway, and they will win that. But whether that which then causes an enormous problem for Madrid, because they still consider this an illegal referendum. But you're right. I mean, I think the Catalans are now sort of so committed to what they're going to do that the Scottish result doesn't have a huge impact on them. But I think it would have a yes vote would have encouraged people in other parts of Europe, perhaps, to dream of secession from wherever, whatever state they happen to be unhappy with at any given time.
Yeah. And do you think, I mean, there is something going on globally? Because, here in the United States, there isn't serious talk of secession, but there's a little bit going on in Texas, and there's actually for a while been a little bit going on in Vermont, so red state and blue state, respectively.
Yeah, revive the Green Mountain Republic.
Right. And I'll tell you, if Obama starts any more wars, I would be tempted to, head there myself and encourage it. But ultimately what that is about, actually, I mean, it's not like Vermont is culturally distinct or linguistically distinct so much, or even Texas, really, in terms of cultural history. It's really about political ideology.
Yeah.
But there was that dimension in Scotland as well, to some extent. And I think what I'm wondering is this fundamentally the same thing going on, where it's kind of geographic separatism or ideological polarization? I mean, I'm a little bit of a technological determinist, so I tend to see some of these things as being partly driven by the ease with which interest groups can organize using, kind of post-internet technology. And I really wonder whether there's a kind of some energy behind devolution going on broadly and along kind of a number of dimensions. Does that sound crazy to you?
I think there's something to that. I mean, I sort of think that it's also partly a reaction to sort of globalization in some ways, that as the world becomes more connected and people feel perhaps often more distant from politics, or feel that they're not able to actually make a difference themselves, that massive international corporations appear to be able to do whatever they want, and they're not sort of subject to local accountability. Where you have a sort of political elite meeting at Davos and sending out all sorts of appallingly stupid and terrible signals to the voters left at home, where you've got a lot of people sort of saying there is no alternative. This is just the way things have to be. That a lot of people chafe against that, and so local association becomes more important in a more sort of, if you like, homogenized world than was the case previously. And the fact that there aren't, I mean, not terrorists and so on notwithstanding, there aren't the sort of external threats that hold places together in some ways. The death of socialism and the death of communism and the end of the Cold War, I think, sort of created space for some of these things to flourish too. Because there was an element of this campaign which was disenchantment with a political establishment in London. But that, of course, you see that sort of disenchantment all across Europe. It's directed towards, say, the EU, but in England, the rise of the UK Independence Party reflects that. I mean, they're on a different part of the political spectrum to the SNP, but there are some commonalities between the sort of sense of frustration with politics as usual, and an equal contempt for, quote, elites, unquote, that you see everywhere. And you see that obviously in the United States too. I mean, with, Congress's reputation is not high at present, but then perhaps it rarely has been. But so I think that there are sort of general forces that are acting, and you see them, in lots of different countries. The rise of the National Front in France, of the True Finns in Finland, an awful lot of stuff going on in Hungary at the moment, where it's a sort of populist revolts, some of them of varying degrees of pleasantness or unpleasantness. And there are some things that all of these situations have in common, yes.
Well, and maybe the next step, is for the workers of the world to unite, in the sense that, having distanced themselves from entities that they find alienating, these, again, to the extent that this is a kind of anti-elite thing, joining up with groups around the world that are like-minded. I mean, in theory, that, just in kind of technological theory, that should be happening too. I don't know how much it is.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, in theory, that would make sense. I mean, as I say, there was a sort of contact between as in this instance between Catalan secessionists and Scottish
Right. So a
separatists,
little of that. Yeah.
but you're not really talking about very deep or meaningful contact there, or a sense that it had any great impact, um, but yeah, I mean, I just think that, there is a sort of problem more generally with sort of political alienation
Mm-hmm.
at the moment. And one of the reasons why people actually quite enjoyed, or a lot of people enjoyed this campaign, was that it was real politics, and there was a sense that, as one nationalist politician put it, between the hours of 7 in the morning and 10 at night, on polling day, the Scottish people, and people like that. It was a big ideas, big politics, a proper argument over something substantial, and where people felt that their votes might make a difference, and consequently, that's why you had extremely high levels of engagement. But in contrast to that, day-to-day messy and compromised and difficult and duller, frankly, and so people feel sort of distant from it, because it's harder and less exciting.
From everyday politics that emanates from London.
Yeah, yeah.
We lost you for a second there, and I wanted to recapitulate. Yeah,
yeah. That people, the sort of. Something like the independence campaign allowed people to construct a future Scotland, an alternative Scotland in their imagination, and that obviously is a much happier thing to do in many ways than wrestle with the actual detail of, say, how to reform social security or the National Health Service or whatever and so on. And you have this sort of fantasy land in your mind where the sort of compromises that are a necessary part of governance don't actually have to happen, where you can have your cake and eat it, and what's more, you won't even have to pay for your cake. So I can see why people enjoyed the referendum, and why ordinary politics is much more sort of humdrum and banal.
You mentioned national security, alluded to national security earlier, and mentioned terrorism. Do you think that has something to do with this? I mean, first of all, 200 years ago, in a certain way, it was a more dangerous world. Nations fought each other a lot more, oops. Yeah, you're still there. And there was some, for a relatively small place like Scotland, there was some security in being part of a larger entity. Now, is there in Scotland almost the reverse sense that, well, there is this terrorism threat, but lately Britain's policies have, if anything, exacerbated the threat of terrorism in the homeland, because Britain keeps getting involved in the in the Iraq War, and so on.
I guess for people, particularly on the left of Scottish politics, some people would have that sense or make that association, but it wasn't something, to be honest, that really played any part in the campaign. Defence issues and security issues weren't a major part of it. I mean, and to the extent they were, it was more about an independent Scotland being a member of NATO, and what would happen with the UK submarine base, which is currently based, on the Clyde, and the missile silos there. How would they be moved? But other defence and security issues didn't really come into play, nor did any sort of foreign policy matters at all, actually, really, except where they impacted on the EU, Scotland's membership of it. What happens if the rest of the UK decides at some point to leave the EU, but there is a majority in Scotland in favour of remaining in the EU? But that was, which was actually quite a good thing, I think.
We missed that last part. What was a good thing?
It was a good thing that people weren't really raising the spectre of terrorism on either side. I mean, I think that would have sort of soured the discussion in some ways,
even more than it was soured by some things. Okay, final question. Although you voted no, Is part of you disappointed that you don't get to see the experiment? I mean, it would be really interesting to see what happened next, right?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, and there are, I mean, I think there are a number of people who voted no who sort of, it's not that they wish the country had voted yes, but they would have quite enjoyed seeing what would happen next. And obviously, from a journalistic point of view, yes would have been the better outcome because it's a bigger story that would have run for years and years and years. And there's something intuitively, quite appealing about building a country from the beginning.
Sure.
And so, yeah, there's a little bit of ambivalence about that. Certainly, I mean, I think that that's only natural, actually, because you do wonder what might have been. And in this sense, I suppose we may get another chance in a dozen, 15 years to think about it again. But independence was forever, which was something that the No campaign stressed very heavily in the final days of the campaign. And that, I think, helped pull people back into voting no, because there was a sort of thing you could do. Well, we can vote now, and if we're unhappy in 10 years' time, we can have another think about independence. We can have another referendum. So the sort of prudent and safer option, if you like, was to vote no.
Okay. Well, I would like to have you back on Blogging Heads sometime before the next independence vote.
Absolutely,
absolutely.
Okay, yeah, no, be delighted to. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, Alex.
All right. Okay. Cheers then, Bob.
All right. Bye-bye.